I went to New York many times on behalf of the city of Grapevine over the years, and almost every year we visited the Twin Towers. I remembered them very well. They had beautiful brass elevators that shined like gold, and we would go up to the top to the windows of the world and have lunch. You could look out the window down on the bay and see the Statue of Liberty. It was just an awesome sight. We never dreamed that day, someday, that would be the site of the world's greatest terrorist attack. On that September morning, my wife awoke me, as a matter of fact, and told me that a plane had hit one of the towers in New York. At that point, we didn't know it was a terrorist attack, thought it might have been an accident. People were waking up to that knowledge, I guess, all over the world. And news media soon made it clear that it was an intentional act. There were other events going on. Suddenly the world was in shock. It was just inconceivable, unbelievable, uncomprehendable that an airplane could be used as a weapon, that it could fly into a building and explode and then destroy the entire building. We were told by the news media that the building had a good chance of collapsing, unimaginable, but people watched in awe, in shock. We saw the President Bush being notified of the attack. Nothing had ever been conceived in America since the Civil War that we could be attacked to this extent. And then we watched that building, the first one, collapse and go down. So many people losing their life at that very moment. It was just surreal. It was, everybody was in shock. We then knew that there was a plane that had hit the Pentagon. We knew another plane had gone down in Pennsylvania. And I got dressed, went on to work, and then we got news that the second plane had hit the second tower, and it went down pretty quick too. By then, the world was shutting down. Everybody was closing down. Planes were ordered on the ground. It was immediately a time of mourning for America, a time of reflection, a time of togetherness, a time of understanding the rest of the world and that we were vulnerable regardless of all of our powers and all of our weapons. It was a message for the people of America, and we received it rather quickly and rather subtly. And so the events unfurled. It's hard to believe that 20 years have already come and gone since that event. So many wonderful Americans died, civilians, so many police and firemen, so many civilians on airplanes, the flight crews, across the board. America had a host of new heroes. And it's a day that will never be forgotten in America, never be forgotten in our community because of our ties to aviation and to American Airlines. We're grateful to have the statute, the memorial to the flight crews in our community, and to be reminded every day as we pass about that event and the risks that we take and what we have to do to work together and be vigilant to keep our freedoms.
I'm Julie Hedrick, National President of the Association of Professional Flight Attendants, the union representing the 25,000 flight attendants at American Airlines.
I'm Larry Salas, National Vice President of the Association of Professional Flight Attendants. Today, on this 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, we pause to remember and honor the victims and first responders of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Flight attendants were the first of many heroes who perished that day. Today, we remember Boston-based crew members. Barbara Aristegi, Jeffrey Coleman, Sarah Lowe, Karen Martin, Kathleen Nikosha, Betty Ong, Jean Roger, Diane Snyder, Madeline Sweeney, Captain John Oganowski, First Officer Thomas McGinnis.
At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Today, we remember the Boston-based crew members: Robert Fangman, Amy Jarrett, Amy King, Catherine Labore, Alfred Marchand, Michael Taru, Alicia Titus, Captain Victor Saracini, and First Officer Michael Horrocks.
At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. We remember the Washington-based crew members: Michelle Heidenberger, Jennifer Lewis, Kenneth Lewis, Renee May, Captain Charles Burlingame, First Officer David Charlevoix.
At 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We remember the Newark-based crew members: Lorraine Bay, Sandra Bradshaw, Wanda Green, Cece Lyles, Deborah Welsh, Captain Jason Dahl, First Officer Leroy Homer. 25 flight attendants, 8 pilots, and additional active and retired members of the American Airlines and United Airlines families died on September 11. We honor them today and every day, along with the heroic first responders who risked their lives without hesitation. We will never forget.
September the 11th should have been a normal day at Gander, but it turned out to be a day like no other with the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers. As a result, 38 large aircraft landed in Gander, bringing approximately 6,800 people to our town of about 10,000. The Knights of Columbus took care of the passengers off American Airlines flight that was captained by Beverly Bass. I went to the Comfort Inn to meet with Captain Bass, and she was wondering where she could get a rental car while they were here in Gander. This was not possible as we do not have that many rental cars in Gander. So I handed her the keys to my brand new pickup and I said, "Here, use this as long as you're here." And she said, "You don't even know who I am. Aren't you all afraid that I may steal your truck?" I told her that would not happen as we live on an island and it was okay to use my truck. Thus began a 20-plus year friendship with Beverly, Tom, Paige, and Taylor. Starting on September 12th, I recall the school bus drivers who were on strike returning to work because they wanted to assist. The pharmacists working 24 hours a day filling prescriptions because they were needed. Normal citizens of Gander cooking and entertaining people to make them feel a little more at ease and to know that they were loved. I did not realize the significance of those small acts of kindness until years later. The citizens of Gander opened their doors to the world and showed them what we are made of. Without paying significance to people's race, religion, sexual preference, color of skin, clothes they wore, or language they spoke, we welcome them. We welcome them as human beings. They were in need and we could be of assistance. The citizens of Gander and area stepped up. I was never prouder to say that I was from Gander than I was at that time. Today, as I look back, I'm still proud of the citizens of Gander. The friendships that were formed by tragedy on September the 11th are still strong today, but many of these people are regarded today as family members. Finally, as Captain Bass once said, be kind, be nice, pay it forward, and do the unexpected when nobody is watching.
So once we got our hotel assignment, we proceeded into the terminal. We hadn't seen any of the images yet. And as we walked through the terminal, there was a group of passengers crowded around the one TV in the terminal, I believe. And the images were on the screen. It was pretty tough to see it for the first time. All the passengers looked at us. They were very quiet, very solemn. I remember I had to look at the ground. It was very intense. Fortunately, we did get to the hotel, and then we bonded together as a crew. We were stuck there for 3 days in Wichita. We came together. I have to honor my crew. I couldn't have had a better first officer, a better cabin crew to get through that moment. We were all separated from our families, our friends, and our loved ones, but we were safe and we weren't in jeopardy. I would like to personally honor all the heroes of that moment in history, our history. You know, the crew members we lost that day, the crew members that fought to save their airplane that day, the brave firemen that rushed into those burning buildings, and all the first responders. You know, I'd also like to honor our country in that moment. We came together as one. We put aside our differences, we rose up, and we stood together strong. Finally, and most importantly, for me personally, I'd like to thank my wife and kids for being strong and brave that day, those following days till I could get home, and all the nights where I had to leave them to do my job, like many Americans. We go out and we do our job, and that's important.
What I remember most about September the 11th, 2001 were meeting so many new people. Our town doubled in size that day. We had 38 planes, thousands of passengers. It was like something out of the movies. I remember driving down the street, seeing so many strange faces. And likewise, I'm sure my face looked strange to them. I remember bringing meals to the schools, to the churches. I remember walking with a box of extra toiletries that I had in my house to drop off at the school. And I guess really what I remember most are all the friendships that we made. And I remember that feeling of emptiness when everybody left 5 days later. So I guess for myself, definitely was a memorable moment in my life. But I remember it for all the good and for all the positive that came out of that day, and for the remarkable, wonderful friendships that I've made.
All right, so there are a lot of things about September 11 that I remember. And in so many ways, it changed not just our lives, but it changed our law enforcement profession. And specifically, you know, on a personal level, an interesting story is that my family and I were in Colorado, camping in the mountains when on September 11th. And to some degree, we really had no idea what had occurred on that day. And we spent a couple of days in the mountains, and then we came out, and we began to hear the news stories. We began to talk to people and experienced and discovered rather what had actually happened to the country. And one of the things I've always found interesting is during that time that we were in the mountains, we were pretty high, and I remember hearing the stories about how all the air traffic had ceased. And one night, my son and I were at a very small lake in very high, about probably 12,000 feet, and there were fighter jets just screaming across the sky, and he and I sat there and just listened to them, and you could really see them in the night sky flying across. And it's always been a profound moment because I didn't understand what was going on, but I understood that something was causing that because we'd been into Colorado many times and had never seen such behavior. It changed law enforcement both at a local level and at a national level tremendously. I mean, it brought those two law enforcement partners together, and now we collaborate in so many different ways that maybe we hadn't before then. We're involved in major events here in town, and we reach out to our federal partners constantly on those sorts of events. And those sorts of practices probably didn't exist before then. At the end of the day, when I think about 9/11, and every year that goes by, and as we're at the 20th anniversary, if that's what we choose to call it, I'm really struck by the idea that we as a country can never forget how our history was changed, how we as a country moved in a direction that, for the layperson, many of us never saw coming. And we're different today because of that. And the other piece is that I think being in the 20th year is remarkable, is that we have now a whole generation of individuals who weren't alive. And so we know from past history and experiences that the further we get from the event, how that story can be lost. And I think it's important not just that we recognize the day, that will always be important, but that we tell the story, where you were at, or how it impacted you, or what you saw or you didn't see or you heard, or what your family members remember, or your friends. There were so many acts of heroism that day. There were, first responders running into building, police officers and firefighters alike. There were flight crews that saved people that they didn't even know by managing their way through critical situations on an airplane. There were government employees at the Pentagon that worked to save others' lives, and those are the heroes that we know about. I'm convinced there are equal amount of heroes in the everyday citizen, the everyday American, that we'll never know about. And those stories are important. Those stories have got to be told. Those stories have got to be remembered. And I think on this 11th day of September that we make certain, as both an individual and as a family and as a country, that we remember what happened on that day in our country.
On September 11, 2001, my day began like any other day. By mid-morning, I would hear about the tragic events in the United States, and before we could reach lunchtime, I would come to realize that this was no ordinary day, especially when you're the mayor of Gander, and Gander Airport was about to get extremely busy. In the events in the wake of September 11, 2001 that would occupy Gander and the towns that surrounded it were enormous. Gander, with a population of 9,300 at the time, would welcome almost 7,000 guests with no notice or preparation time. Yet in the events that could have been perceived as impossible, we rose to the occasion and provided the stranded passengers with memories and hospitality that would place us on the world stage as an example to others. Through our giving Newfoundland heritage, we would care for our guests in the spirit of loving and caring that the world would come to know as amazing.
Hello and welcome to the 9/11 Flight Crew Memorial. My name is Cindy Dawson and I'm a pilot with American Airlines. Behind me sits the large bronze sculpture on top of Texas limestone, centered on the north, south, east, and west directional indicator known as the compass rose. The captain stands at the highest point, charged with the responsibility of protecting passengers, fellow crew member, and the aircraft. To the right is the first officer. With the safety manual in hand, he points to the western horizon, the intended destination of all 4 flights, and the ultimate destination of all on board. Indicative of her role as a safety professional, the female flight attendant stands in the protected position, her hand held in the international sign for stop, thus shielding her passengers from harm. The male flight attendant drapes a blanket around a small child, displaying the commitment to passenger care and service. And the young girl with her teddy bear represents the traveling public. She is the family on their big vacation, the newlyweds on their honeymoon, and the grandmother on her very first flight. She is also the weary businessman, and unfortunately now, she also represents soldiers off to war. At the front, a stone column rises to support a large globe because the aviation industry spans the world. The impressive eagles, a national symbol of freedom, represent both airlines, American and United, who lost flights that day. In total, there were 4 aircraft with 33 crew members, consisting of 8 pilots and 25 flight attendants. They carried 213 passengers from 22 states and 7 countries. The 9/11 Flight Crew Memorial was the vision of American Airlines flight attendant Valerie Thompson. Her husband Dean Thompson spent 7.5 years fundraising, crafting, and sculpting the pieces to bring Valerie's dream to life. It is now dedicated to the flight crew members that were lost and all crew members who courageously continue to be the ever-vigilant professionals of the airline industry. Additionally, today, the grounds now host memorials to the 343 firefighters and 71 police and law enforcement persons who served valiantly to the end. With the smoke still rising in New York, D.C., and Pennsylvania, we all came together and steadfastly declared, we will never forget. We would not forget those we lost. We would not forget our heroes. We would not forget what happened, nor would we fall in fear. And now, 20 years later, we haven't forgotten. And today, this weekend, we resolve to always remember. As you visit, please remember that this site is sacred ground. Walk quietly, speak softly, pray if you will, and cry if you must. But please, always remember to look up to the sky.
I woke up in the Crowne Plaza Hotel in Washington, D.C. to what is no doubt one of the best weather days I have ever experienced. My crew and I went out to Ronald Reagan Airport, planning to fly our passengers to Las Vegas. We pushed off the gate and started our taxi out to runway 1 when the ground controller announced, all aircraft going to New York Center airspace, pull off to the right. About 10 airplanes pulled over, and one pilot asked what was going on. The reply came from another pilot that an airplane had crashed into one of the World Trade Center buildings. I was headed west in my 757 with a pretty big fuel load and wanted to depart before traffic delays would no doubt begin to build. In front of me was an American MD-80 headed for DFW. They were cleared for takeoff, and I watched as their power came up, and then they pulled back on the power and told Washington Tower their company wanted them to return to the gate. He cleared the runway. Tower told us, Cactus 85, you are cleared for takeoff. We acknowledged and took off to the north, banking to the northwest to stay west of the east bank of the Potomac River and yet not overfly the Pentagon. I did not know I would be the last commercial flight to depart Reagan that day. Tower told us to contact departure control. It took a couple of calls to departure control before he answered, and when he did, it was with a quivering voice. Controllers' voices never quiver. We were climbing through 5,000 feet when an American 757 passed close by us in a descent going east, and he wasn't in the normal traffic flow. My first officer and I commented on it, but we figured he wasn't that close or our TCAS would have gone off. As we passed 10,000 feet, I asked Preston if he would listen to the ADF, which is an AM radio, and see what was going on in New York. He listened for about 15 seconds and told me both World Trade Center towers had been flown into by 767s. We came to the conclusion that this was not an accident and our country was under attack. A moment later, as Preston continued to monitor the ADF, he told me a bomb had just exploded at the Pentagon. I said, we just flew by the Pentagon. About 30 seconds after that, he said, no, they think an airplane just crashed into the Pentagon. Our initial thought was to get as far away from the East Coast as possible because bad things were happening. It never occurred to me that we could have been one of the target airplanes, and I am obviously glad we were not. As we leveled off at 35,000 feet, our company dispatcher called us on cell call and informed us the FAA was shutting down all U.S. airspace. He told us to divert either to Columbus or Indianapolis. I chose Indy because it was further west and I would burn off just enough fuel so I would not have to make an overweight landing. We told our flight attendants and then made a PA to our passengers to let them know we would be landing in Indianapolis at least for a while. After landing, our lead flight attendant came up to the flight deck and reminded me we had 3 unaccompanied minors on our flight. I told her to make sure the city manager knew and let him figure out what to do for them. She came back a couple minutes later and told me that all 3 of these kids had uncles that lived in Indianapolis. I did not know this at the time I made my choice to land at Indy, but it is a testimony that the Lord was watching out for them that day. I thought of a scripture that is familiar to all of us, Psalm 121. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. I did not know at the time it happened that the American 757 that passed us was the aircraft that hit the Pentagon. It wasn't until later that evening, when the timeline came out, that Preston and I figured out that it was. When I finally got to Phoenix on Thursday evening, Sherry had my first cell phone waiting for me. Mine is just one story of thousands that are told, but I thought I would share it with you. Thanks for listening.
We took our passengers to Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada. What I remember most is the solidarity, the togetherness of crew, passengers, and the people of Moncton. Thank you.
On that day, I got the watch as the planes arrived. It was, it's hard to describe the feeling that was going through my mind at the time to watch all these planes landing. I knew about the passengers and how many people there would be on there. One of the things that I experienced, let's say, was I was here during the whole time. I got the privilege, I guess you could call it a privilege, but I'll call it that. I got to drive around to all the different venues that had passengers. I got to see the looks on the passengers' faces when they first arrived. The look of despair, the crying, of being totally lost and not knowing what was going on. But then I got to watch how the residents of this town came together, how they encouraged, how they hugged, how they laughed, how they brought the people, as we call them, the plain people, around. On Monday or on Tuesday and part of Wednesday, it was the look of despair. And as you got closer into the week, you could see them changing. You could see the looks on their faces, and they were feeling safe, I guess is a better word for it. They were feeling safe, that they were in a place that they were truly loved. And by the end of the week, there was laughing, there was music, there was just that family atmosphere that as Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, we always have. In the beginning, when they arrived, there was tears. At the end, when they left, there was tears. But it was tears of leaving behind family members. They enjoyed it here. They found their sanctuary while this was all going on. And to listen to them and to listen to what they were saying sort of done your heart good.
September 11th, 2001. You know, most all of us remember exactly what we were doing when we heard about the attack on our nation. For me, it was a special morning in that I'd got off work from the firehouse. I was a battalion chief in my department at that time. And I made it home and my phone started blowing up, getting ready to go work my second job. It was one of those things where it was unreal. I couldn't believe it was happening, not on American soil. I'd heard my father talk about Pearl Harbor and when he was a boy and how that impacted him. But this was really the first big one, other than maybe landing on the moon back in the 70s, that I remember, that something this magnitude. And as we watched that unfold that day, and then learning, for me personally, that 343 members of the Fire Department of New York had perished when the collapse occurred. And then as days and weeks and months went on, and just hearing about the different stories of those members and how they had talked to some of the survivors, they knew going up those towers, going up those stairs, they weren't ever coming back. The amount of fire and the fuel load from the planes hitting those towers, but yet their courage, their realism of knowing, you know, and telling each other, hey brother, I may never see you again, but I'm going up. You know, and I think about some of the people that I've read about. I didn't have the opportunity to know them, but just some of the stories that I remember. You know, firefighter Andrew Fredericks, he had been out with knee surgery. He got to take his child to kindergarten. Now 21 years later, 20 years later, you know, she's certainly out of kindergarten, probably out of college, but that was his first shift back on the job. So his family cherished that time that he had had at home. You know, I think about another decorated member of their department, and since my last name's Brown, his last name, you know, he was a Captain Patrick Brown, and he checked in and he refused the order because they ordered 3 trucks. He was on 3 trucks there to evacuate the building, and he refused to evacuate because there were too many people injured and hurt in the stairwells, and he continued on up to try to help them to get them down to safety. So September 11th, I'll never forget, and I'll always remember those firefighters, police officers, medical workers, and just those almost 3,000 civilians that paid the ultimate price that day for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were doing their job. They were doing their normal lives. I actually have a personal friend who used to live here in Grapevine. She was scheduled to be in the World Trade Center that day, and her meeting got moved to another part of Manhattan. And when we talk about that, I mean, she gets big old alligator tears because she was able still to raise her family and have her kids. But when you what if it, she could have been one of those that perished that day. September 11th, 2001 to September 11th, 2021, it's still real fresh on a lot of people. I miss the flags and the patriotism that we saw after that. Our country needs that, but I hope we don't have to endure something like that again for our country to remember what we've been through.
Hi, I'm Don Carty. I was the CEO of American Airlines 20 years ago when the horrific events of 9/11 occurred. And the memories and the images that I have from that day will stay in my head and in my heart for as long as I live. From the first call I received from our ops center telling me that a hijacking was underway, to watching Flight 11 crash into the North Tower, to my decision to ground the American Airlines fleet, to watching the two towers fall, to seeing the devastation at the Pentagon, to realizing that we had lost some wonderful American Airlines teammates. The one positive memory I have of that time was seeing the resolve and the strength of the American people to endure. And in particular, the pride I felt in the courage and the resilience of the American Airlines team, who came together to put American back in the air in spite of the fear and trepidation that all of us felt. For that memory, I will always be grateful. God bless you all.
My name is Angelina Televanowitz, and I am one of the original board members of the 9/11 Flight Crew Memorial. Unfortunately, out of abundance of caution, I am unable to make the trip down to Dallas, Texas from Minnesota, which is extremely heartbreaking. We look at this first national public memorial sculpture titled Valor, Commitment, Dedication for the 33 flight crew members that perished 20 years ago on September 11th, 2001. This memorial is also a representation to all flight crew members that continue today their unselfish dedication to aviation safety. I am honored and I am proud to have been a part of the arranging and the connecting of all the array of parts of this beautiful memorial, and moreover, the meaning behind it that stands in front of you today. This sacred place will forever be embedded in my heart and in my soul. God bless each and every one of you, and God bless America. Thank you.
It's really hard to believe that it was 20 years ago that I sat pretty much in this exact spot, and for the next few days would be on TV giving information to an awful lot of people who had found themselves stranded right here in Gander. It's even harder to believe that when I did that first show on the morning of September the 12th, I'd been on my feet for 27 hours without sleep, and even harder to believe that I wouldn't get to bed for the next 4 days. It was a busy time, but people, in the absence of social media, were reliant on newspaper, radio, and TV. That's why people like me here at Rogers TV and a young reporter named Janice Henstrich, who's now Janice Gowdy, on her first day on the job here in Gander, became kind of key people in the movement of the whole thing. But so did so many hundred others. It was an amazing effort. It was an amazing time. And despite how tired we all were at the end of it, you had that great feeling that you'd done something really good for an awful lot of people. And to be honest with you, that's one of the greatest feelings in the world. On the 20th anniversary, take some time. Think about 20 years ago. Let's hope that we never see such a thing again. But take an extra special bit of time today just to be nice to someone. It's the greatest feeling in the world.
Probably like millions of Americans, my first reaction was disbelief. I just couldn't believe that this was happening in America in September. I happen to work for American Airlines, and I was notified that a plane that was being flown by a friend of mine was in the process of being hijacked. And that's how I first heard about the beginnings of the World Trade Tower tragedy. When FEMA wants an asset that the Air Force has, it's my job to inform FEMA of what the Air Force can bring to the fight, can bring to aid people in need, and then it is to speak to the Air Force to say, FEMA needs this, and to get it. So my job is to really represent the Air Force at this FEMA team and inform on the one side and go ahead and facilitate on the other side. And DOT is a subordinating partner, a part of this federal response. We were under attack, and DOD did respond. When the towers fell, they took out New York City's Office of Emergency Management. My orders were to report to Maynard, Mass, and to help stand up the Regional Operations Center. New York City's OEM chose to relocate to an alternate location within the city. Once communications were reestablished, FEMA relocated and I was reassigned to New York City. Our job at FEMA is to coordinate the federal response, to support the state and the city of New York, to aid the first responders, the real heroes at ground zero. Responding to a disaster is, there's hundreds of people in a simultaneous response. Many things are happening all at the same time. It was very important to have the federal government on site, as well as the Department of Defense on site at ground zero, and helping to facilitate this big federal response that was all being marshaled towards the city of New York and the first responders. The first place we went to was ground zero to get an initial assessment of what was happening. It was at night, it was surreal. And the feelings that I had, once again, shock, disbelief, physical revulsion from seeing the devastation and the size of the destruction. It was very reassuring to look into the sky and see Vermont and other fighters providing combat air patrol over the city of New York. This was a total force effort. The United States Army, Navy, Marines, even the Coast Guard was represented at FEMA. We set up operation centers and planning centers at various locations. We airlifted 17 urban search and rescue teams from various locations around the country. In addition to urban search and rescue teams, defense mortuary teams and medical teams needed to get from other various locations around the country to ground zero. The United States Air Force and Army assets helped to make that happen. We helped the communications effort at ground zero. Through the Florida Air National Guard, they got 1,000 pre-channelized radios from a Motorola factory in Fort Lauderdale overnight on location the next morning. And it provided the command and control comm so that incident command posts could coordinate these 3,500 first responders. We provided specialized equipment and personnel to assist in the search and rescue efforts. We had remote sensing equipment and specialized radar equipment that the Army had, and infrared devices that helped. Laser Doppler technology with trained personnel also helped. Army had remote robotics that were able to search for survivors and to also do some assessment of stability of buildings and parts underground that people just couldn't do. We also provided demolition experts, security forces. The DoD was also able to provide thousands of body pouches for the first responders to use at Ground Zero. The U.S. naval ship Comfort was deployed to New York City. It provided 1,000 beds, which were used for medical assistance, housing, and also provided a huge presence, a reassuring presence to the people of the city of New York. It was a privilege to be a small part of a huge DoD team that responded to the people of the city of New York.